Emotions Matter, brought to you by Emaww.com. That's EMAWW.com, your solution for emotional intelligence. Welcome to the Emotions Matter podcast. We are fortunate to have a wonderfully passionate guest on this episode, Zoe Harris. Zoe has spent the last 5 years researching person-centered care for people living with dementia as a result of her husband's experience of living with dementia. She has developed a number of award-winning communication tools, both paper-based and online, to ensure that a person's needs and preferences can be made available to everyone interacting with them, even if they are unable to express these things for themselves. Zoe is passionate about the importance of seeing the whole person and not just their medical condition, whether in their home, a care home, or in the hospital. She speaks regularly about what she has learned from her husband's experience and runs workshops for care home staff to explore what person-centered care really means. The Remember I'm Me range of care charts can be seen at carechartsuk.co.uk. All one word, carechartsuk.co.uk. And the My Care Matters online platform is at mycarematters, all one word, mycarematters.org. Welcome, Zoe, and thank you for taking the time to share with our audience on the podcast.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Zoe, you started your research after you've seen your husband living with dementia. Do us a favor, walk our listeners through the beginnings of that experience.
Yes, well, everyone has a unique experience of the onset of dementia. But in Jeff's case, it was so gradual that it was actually years before I realized that I was compensating for his declining abilities. But I've always kept a diary, and when I look back, I realized that he was doing less and less. I don't have a medical or a social care background, and it took 4 years to get a diagnosis of dementia. So you just get on with life, and as your caring role takes over, you have less and less time to take a step back and think whether there's a better way of doing things. And in terms of emotions, the most significant memories I have of my feelings and emotions at that time was really two things, loneliness and guilt. So loneliness is perhaps typical when a spouse becomes a carer and they've lost that partnership they might have had with the person where you've been sharing decision making. And in the early years, it's almost worse because the person with dementia will be aware that things aren't right. Perhaps they'll put a show on of trying to keep everything normal, when in fact for them the world has become a really confusing and frightening place. And guilt is probably common to, I would say, to virtually every carer, regardless of how much effort they're putting into their care. You still feel inadequate, that you're letting the person down. You get tired because you're never off duty. Your patience is tested by seemingly illogical behavior, repeated questions, and those sort of things. You end up yelling at your loved one, even getting physically aggressive because you're just at the end of your tether. And then there's the extra layer of guilt when you can no longer cope and you have to ask for help either temporarily by booking respite or eventually by finding them a place in a care home.
Terrific. Thank you for that. Well, let me ask you something. So what is the difference in your approach before and then after your research?
Yes, well, my research really only started when Jeff had to move to a care home for what turned out to be the final 13 months of his life. And I was stumbling about in the dark, trying to find ways to help the care home staff know about the things that mattered to him. I think we're probably going to come on to what I developed to help with that. But it's worth saying now, of the time that I cared for Jeff at home, that if I'd known then what I know now, I do a lot of things differently. One of the first things I'd change is that I would ask for help sooner. I'd bring people in who really understood how to reach people with dementia. Mm-hmm. When I did eventually get help, I realized that the average paid carer is not given nearly enough training to care for someone with this condition. So the default position is often to treat the person like a child, to control their behavior and to restrict their activity under the guise of keeping them safe. And when this was happening with Jeff, I could see that he just hated that patronizing approach. The best carers were those with empathy, who were able to understand that Jeff, as an adult, was entitled to respect and dignity. However, he'd managed to lose any ability to communicate. So I'd now have far higher aspirations for him and his quality of life, because I understand now that even when dementia is quite far advanced, the person can still have a decent quality of life. Not that I'd want to paint a rosy picture of what can still be a really dreadful disease with appalling consequences and outcomes for the person and for everyone around them.
How did having a person in your family living with dementia affect your professional life? Did you feel guilt for not doing the best you can to help him?
I think I'd have left my full-time job even if Jeff had not become ill, because I wanted to spend more time with our daughters. At the time, about 8 and 10, and about 10 and 12 when Jeff's illness started to show. I'd never been able to find an appropriate work-life balance when I was running a busy marketing department. So I'd spend my life at home feeling guilty that I wasn't giving my best to my work, and at work feeling guilty that I wasn't spending more time at home. So I left that and I took on part-time work that I could do from home. I was already in that situation when he started to get ill, and it was quite a natural process for me to then get increasingly involved in his business. So as he started to get ill, I just took on more from him, and he did less, both professionally and in our home life. Yeah, so I think in the early days, I didn't feel guilt. As I said right at the beginning, I wasn't even aware that I was becoming a carer. I think perhaps where guilt kicked in was the challenge of having a young family as well. And I was very conscious that Jeff would want me to prioritize them. I would know that. But equally, his needs became more demanding until it got to the stage where I was literally having to take them to school, for example, and leaving him for maybe half an hour and worrying that even in that half an hour something would happen. And so it was as his illness progressed that I suppose the stress of trying to keep all of those plates spinning would have an impact on me.
You just mentioned that you had children. I don't know what were their ages?
Yes, well, they were about 10 and 12 when dementia started to have an impact on Jeff's behavior.
So how did your children deal with their father living with dementia?
In quite extreme ways, in a certain way. First of all, they had to cope with a parent becoming a person they didn't know and who eventually didn't know them. And as we all know, teenagers become embarrassed by their parents anyway. So just think how much worse it is when that parent starts behaving in strange and unconventional ways. They'd get irritated by his inability to do things. And my younger daughter particularly became extremely angry for a while. And I think that was largely due to fear about what was happening. One of the benefits of a diagnosis, which I think I said before, did take a long time, was that I could finally confirm to them that their father's irrational behavior was due to a physical illness affecting his brain. And I tried to separate for them the illness from the father they loved, but were sometimes frightened by. Towards the end of the time that Jeff was able to stay at home, we had this rather strange situation where ostensibly I would be asking him to babysit them if I was having to go out. But in fact, the reality was that they were babysitting him.
So did your children ultimately come around and then have the ability to provide love and support and care? Even though they were young, did they sort of become used to it or become accustomed to it and then go back to their loving ways?
Yes, of course, as life is for all of us, we have ups and downs and good days and bad days. And what was really clear to me, even during the time that they were struggling with this, they also were adapting amazingly well to the situation. And I'm really proud when I look back of how naturally they slipped into a role of helping Jeff find his way to the bathroom. He got to the stage where he couldn't remember where one room was from one minute to the next. Or they'd have to help him at the table cutting up his food when he lost the ability to use a knife and fork. And then there were times that they would find amazing levels of patience to answer his questions that they'd probably just answered 5 minutes earlier. Mm-hmm. He loved to be involved in their schoolwork and their activities. And as I say, would sort of repeatedly ask questions about how things were going, and they would have to answer time and time again. And whilst, of course, there were many times when they would lose their cool and they would get irritated, there were other times when, for children going through a very strange experience, found amazing levels of patience and love for him.
Mm-hmm. I'll have to tell you, I also experienced my mother had dementia. Tell me how quickly your husband moved into the stages. It sounds like he moved into his stages, deeper stages, a little quicker than my mom did. How long did it take to get to the point where it was very progressed for him?
Well, a number of things happened that I think accelerated his decline. So those early years, it was a very slow and perhaps steady decline, whilst he was still able to do quite a lot of things. For example, as a family, we went skiing right up until the year before he went into a care home, and he was able to ski and to find his way by himself down the slopes and back to the hotel if that's what he wanted to do. And yet he was unable to find his way from the dining room buffet table back to our table within the one dining room. So there's very strange things going on. And it's sometimes very difficult to explain to people how he would have a level of insight into certain aspects of life and be profoundly confused by other things that would be simple to the rest of us. But in terms of timing, one of the things that accelerated his decline was that it was discovered that he had a detached retina. And the important thing when you have a detached retina is to have it operated on as quickly as possible in order to retain as much eyesight as possible. He'd not given me any indication that there was anything wrong with his eyesight, but I could see that if he reached out for his mug on the table, for example, he would miss it. So obviously something was going wrong. It got diagnosed, and within 24 hours, he'd been whipped into hospital for an overnight stay and an hour-long operation under local anesthetic. And I was really impressed with how the system dealt with it so quickly. But in hindsight, I realized that all they were considering was his eye, and we're not giving him any thought to whether this was an appropriate thing to do for somebody with what was then quite advanced dementia. And up until that point, he had been on a fairly even keel for a while. Mm-hmm. But I was the last person to ask whether this was an appropriate thing to do, because I say even keel, but his body clock this was sort of the new normal for me, if you like. His body clock was very erratic. And so he would often not sleep for much of the night. And if he didn't sleep, then I wouldn't sleep. So I was quite exhausted. So when somebody said he was going to need a night in hospital, all I heard was that might give me a chance to get a decent night's sleep. So I certainly wasn't the right person to ask whether it was an appropriate thing to do. So sadly, that tipped him into a fairly paranoid state from which he never really recovered. And so it was incidents like that sort of accelerated his decline, if you like. We also went on to experiment with antipsychotics, which was a dreadful experience and probably not something that's appropriate for this particular discussion. So, in general terms, they're understood to be dreadful for people with dementia and to be used with considerable caution. And that didn't help. all of which has sort of accelerated the time that he had to go into a care home.
Mm-hmm. So the time clock, the personal time clock, that's something we experienced with my mother as well. She would literally stay up all night and then sleep the entire day until late in the evening. Although there was nobody with her, my father had died earlier, she became pretty reclusive. Did your husband go through any of that?
He didn't really have the chance to become reclusive at home because we were there as well, except that he did need to have. This is going to sound slightly contradictory. He needed to have routines, but then exactly as you say with your mother, he would then end up being up all night. But in the afternoons, for example, as the illness progressed, he would need to have a snooze. And when he woke from that would be quite a confusing time for him. He would sort of mix up reality with, he might have fallen asleep with the television on, and so he'd mix up reality with what was going on television and get very alarmed and confused by things that were going on. Mm-hmm. And yes, I suppose, again, because we had a family routine, for example, the children would be going to school in the morning and they'd be coming back in the afternoon. Those sort of things would impose a certain routine whilst he still had the insight to recognize all of that. But as things progressed, he sort of did retreat more into his own world. Yes, we would sort of not really see what was going on a day-to-day basis around him.
Did he have other interests, hobbies or anything like that? My mother was very into her music, so she would hide in her room and just basically sit and listen to music all day, and you'd never hear from her the entire day. Did your husband have other things that he was interested in that kept him sort of going?
Well, sadly, some of the things that he really wanted to do sort of became beyond him. Like he was a very enthusiastic and competitive dinghy sailor. And it's not that he lost his cognitive abilities long before he lost his physical abilities, which can cause a problem, of course. So he lost the capacity to go sailing, even though he was physically fit enough to get in the boat. At a more sort of realistic level, on a day-to-day basis in the house, he lost the ability to read. He was always interested in national and international news and events that were going on, but he couldn't read the newspaper after a while. And even though I realized he would sit and watch the news on television, he lost the capacity to really process the information that he was hearing. One of the things that I've always been interested in is there's lots of initiatives going on to find ways to maintain people's interests in life and to keep their brains going. And as you say, music is a big thing, and I think there's a lot of research going on to the benefits of music. Certainly, Jeff enjoyed listening to music, but I found it very difficult to find other things to entertain him that he'd be able to do. It's this finding this balance between finding something to challenge the brain and not setting somebody up to fail. And he was an architect, and people said, well, why don't you get him drawing? But I just felt that to put a piece of paper and pencil in front of Jeff would imply that I'd be expecting him to be designing a house, for example, not painting pretty pictures. And I knew that he would find that a very challenging situation, because this was something that happened with him as he lost the capacity to work, because he worked from home and he might spend a few months developing a project. It took me a while to realize that he was actually just sitting at his desk and unable to actually put pen to paper.
Do you think that exacerbated some frustration for him?
Massively. And I think that one of the things that carers need to be very aware of is that they're getting frustrated by the situation and might be exasperated by some strange behavior. But one needs to think about why that behavior is being exhibited and how frightening the situation must be for the person.
So you mentioned earlier that people living with dementia are still able to feel emotions, but they can't necessarily express them. So that is, as you just mentioned, why is that so important for caregivers to remember this fact?
Yes, it's such an important aspect of caring for someone with dementia. They may not be able to express their emotions verbally, but they are still going to be feeling them and they will display them in other ways. So, people often talk about somebody with dementia having challenging or aggressive behavior. There's always going to be an underlying cause for that, a reason for why they're feeling angry or fearful.
Hmm.
And sometimes the only way they can show that is to lash out. So it's really important that people look beyond the behavior to understand what's going on. I think that it also, in terms of the positive side of this, it can become increasingly difficult to find ways of making moments of happiness. And it's something that carers need to do for both themselves and for the person.
Hmm.
Things like touch, which are very simple, and obviously it's different for each and every person. But when Jeff's dementia was quite advanced, I used to give him a back rub, and I would also massage his hands. And if he was stressed and uncomfortable, I could feel that he would relax into that, and he would enjoy that.
Hmm.
So little things could make a big difference.
Right.
The other aspect I wanted to mention on that is that we had experience of friends and family feeling that Jeff's behavior or Jeff's dementia had got to the stage where he would no longer remember them or if they visited. But in fact, somebody may not remember the details of the visit, but they'll be left with hopefully pleasant emotions if somebody does come to visit them. And that feeling, that positive feeling, can last long after the visit has ended. So they need to be reassured that a visit can still be welcomed and does make a difference to the person right up until the end of life.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your care charts, something that I wish that I had back when I was dealing with my mom's condition. So your care charts are created to remind the caretakers that the patient they're dealing with is a person and not just a job. So how does this help with awakening empathy in the caregivers and as a result in getting really better care for the patients?
Yes, well, it started off with something much more straightforward. What I developed was I did this because mistakes kept occurring in the early days of Jeff's time in a care home because the staff didn't know anything about him. So care homes are required to create a care plan for all of their residents, but I could never understand how the staff, busy as they were, would be able to read and remember the information about each of the people they were caring for. So a very simple example I always use is that Jeff drank his tea black, which is not the typical English way of drinking your tea. And so he was forever being offered milky cups of tea, which he wouldn't drink, but he couldn't explain why. And on a particularly bad weekend when I was unable to visit, it actually resulted in him becoming severely dehydrated. And a person with dementia doesn't bounce back from incidents like those. So on that given weekend, Jeff lost the ability to walk as a result of that dehydration.
My.
So initially I scribbled notes and I stuck them on the wall, just passing over basic information that I thought the staff needed to know to avoid those sort of mistakes. But it all started looking a bit of a mess as the notes added up. And so I turned it into a wall chart and I added symbols so that staff could find the information they needed quickly and easily. So just a facts at a glance. As I say, it started out as a way to avoid the mistakes that would happen if they weren't familiar with his likes and dislikes. But I soon realized that the information I was providing was helping to develop a relationship between Jeff and the people caring for him. When dementia really reaches that stage where they can't communicate in a conventional way and that they can't do anything for themselves, there's a risk that they become really nothing more than a body to be washed, dressed, and fed. Little opportunity for any emotional engagement. So by providing information about their past life, their family, the music they like to listen to, the sport they like to watch, or the fact that they hate watching sport, they have pets or hate animals, they can become a human being again in the eyes of those caring for them.
Mm-hmm.
So research has proven time and time again that when a healthcare professional knows something about their patient, they're more likely to feel empathy for them.
Mm-hmm.
And where empathy exists, the quality of care goes up. And that's really sort of been the foundations of the work that I've been doing in these past years. And whilst a lot of people understand that, there's been very little attempt to actually get the information in front of the people that are interacting with the individual. And I'm not actually just talking about care staff, but in a care home or in a hospital, and we'll talk a bit more about hospitals in a minute, but it's not just the care staff. It might be the kitchen staff, the cleaners, the maintenance people, all have an opportunity to transform the experience of a person's day-to-day life by being able to interact with them. And if you find that you share a love of something or that you've followed the same sports team, there's a chance for a little bit of conversation to just transform, as I say, the quality of life of that person.
So you mentioned the staff. Let's dive into a little bit about the My Care Matters website. Talk us through that and how does it help healthcare professionals deal with and better accommodate care for persons living with dementia?
Yes, well, to jump back slightly to give a bit of context, when I developed that first care chart for Jeff, all I was trying to do was maximize the quality of his care. But when the care home manager saw it and liked it and asked if she could have some more for her other residents, I realized that I'd created something that had the potential to transform the care of people who are unable to communicate their needs and preferences, not just in this care home, but around the country. And so we trialed it, and we then started to offer it to other care homes. And to cut a long story short, they're now in use in over 1,000 care homes around the country.
Oh, terrific.
But when hospitals started to get interested, and yes, it was very clear that something like this was needed in a hospital setting, I realized that their challenge was in collecting the information about a person in the first place. So it seemed an obvious development to invite people to create a record of the things that they wanted healthcare professionals to know about them in advance of a hospital visit. And that's where the internet seemed the obvious place to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so My Care Matters does just that. It's an online platform where people or someone on their behalf can upload the information that they want healthcare professionals to know about them in the event of a hospital visit and when they're unable to express their needs and preferences.
So the connection then becomes a very direct connection between the caregivers or the hospital or the care home to the patient. Is that how it works?
Well, there's two aspects. Yes. I mean, obviously, anybody who ends up in hospital could benefit from a My Care Matters record. But particularly, we're talking about those at greater risk of being in hospital. And obviously, the elderly population are the ones more likely to end up in hospital. And the elderly population also are the ones most likely to have some kind of cognitive impairment. So whether you're living at home or you're in a care home or any other care setting, in the event that you end up in hospital, it's frequently the case that the hospital will have extensive notes about your medical condition, but they will know nothing about you as a person. And hospitals have started to recognize that they do need to improve their person-centered care and that their care can be better for knowing something about the individual. But again, it's a challenge for them to collect that information. Mm-hmm. And people will often end up in A&E from whatever setting they've come with no information about themselves. And so just purely about the medical treatment, the medical condition for which they've been admitted.
Mm. Well, let's move on. We do have a question from one of our listeners who, well, he wanted to remain anonymous. And they're also dealing with a close family member who's living with dementia. And they want to know how to deal with the emotional roller coaster, in their mm-hmm. words, that they're having. They get irritated, they get sad, and they cry. They feel love for the person they care for, etc. But they want to know, is there a catch, something that can really help them get through this emotional roller coaster that they're on?
It's really tough. And it's also really difficult to give advice when we all cope with these things in our own unique way. and everyone's situation is different as well. But in general terms, I'd say that the most important thing is to take care of yourself, to forgive yourself for your failings, because you're going to have failings every single day. It's really not easy when you're always on duty, always dealing with the next crisis, to even think about your own needs. But even if it's just a question of locking yourself in the bathroom for 5 minutes peace, you deserve that brief moment to yourself. So carers need to learn not to beat themselves up when they lose control, when they don't behave in the considered manner that they think that they should have done. And also to remember that the person that you're caring for is still the person that you married, or they may be a parent who brought you up. And it's the illness causing their behavior. It's not that person. And that person is still there, maybe more difficult to reach, but it is still that person. There's other situations that can be even more challenging. Perhaps you've been forced into a caring role against your wishes, which of course can happen. Mm-hmm. A spouse in an unhappy marriage, or an adult child who had an unhappy childhood and is now having to care for their parent out of duty, but not out of love. And those scenarios throw up a whole lot of even more challenging emotions. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, there's a positive side to all of that as well. It's said that the effect of being kind to someone is longer lasting than receiving kindness. And of course, caring for someone is an act of kindness. And so it does bring its rewards as well as what feels like day after day of sort of tribulation. Mm-hmm. So one must be open to those good times, enjoy those good times. There will be some, and recognize them, even if it's only a brief moment amongst all of the stress and anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Great advice. Great advice. Thank you so much. So Zoe, what should we expect from you in the near future or the distant future? Any major plans that you have coming up in the near future? Any plans that you have at the moment?
Well, I think what I get most excited about is finding solutions to problems. So, for example, when people express their concern about confidentiality when using one of my wall charts, I relish the challenge of finding a way to ensure that the information could still be available whilst maintaining confidentiality. And I came up with something that I called the twist and view care chart. So you go into someone's room and all you see is an attractive picture. You turn it over and you have the information that you need to provide the care that takes their needs and preferences into account. And, that solved that particular problem. And in the same way, as I said before, when hospitals started showing an interest, they had a different set of problems. And I'm actually working with a number of hospitals on all sorts of solutions for their situations. And interestingly, not only people with dementia, but people with children as well in hospital. And it's all about finding solutions to help healthcare professionals treat the whole person and not just their medical condition. Developing My Care Matters is taking up most of my time at the moment. Slightly longer term, but it's a very much a related problem. The challenge that I feel is most urgent is how to reach those people who stand to benefit most from a My Care Matters record. Those people who don't have family or friends to support them, they may not be on the internet, so they're increasingly likely to be socially isolated. And they're reaching an age where they are likely to be admitted to hospital, and they are also likely to have some form of cognitive impairment. And I can imagine that in 25 years' time, it's going to be far less of an issue. But we obviously can't write off those millions of isolated people out there now and for the next few years. And there is lots of good work being done to improve the experience of living with dementia. So I'm hopeful that the experience is going to continue to improve, either as the person themselves or caring for someone with dementia, because I think we're going to have to wait a long time for a cure.
Terrific, Zoe. Thank you so much. Well, we sincerely appreciate the time you've taken to be with us today on the Emotions Matter podcast.
Thank you, John. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Again, you can gain access to the Remember I'm Me care charts on the web at carechartsuk.co.uk. That's carechartsuk, all one word, .co.uk. As well as the My Care Matters online platform at mycarematters.org. This is John. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to being with you again on another episode of the Emotions Matter podcast.